Welcome everyone, Michael here with Offshore Citizen. I figured I would do a video from kind of this office hangout area. You can't really see here, but I've got a chessboard in front of me. If you play chess, very good game, super fun. Anyway, today we're going to talk about a little bit of story time thing of a little bit of me, which is kind of how I became an offshore structuring guru. All right, so we shall dive in. So just kind of a little bit of background. I have been an entrepreneur for like ever, okay? So from a very early age, I was super interested in being somebody who excelled and, had a great life, was successful. And so early on when I was in high school, I started my first business. This doesn't seem that young now compared to some friends of mine who have, started businesses when they're 12 or something like that. But it was kind of an entrepreneurial spirit for me. And that kind of leads inevitably, I think, to one of two paths, or maybe both paths. One is, hey, listen, I'm interested in finding ways of optimizing what it is that I'm doing, right? And it also leads to being more international. And both of these things are, pretty critical. So one of the things that I think is really valuable for me, and I'm going to give this to you kind of framed in a way of how can hopefully you think better about your own situation and what it is that you're doing and learn to optimize, because I think that I have some unique advantages compared to a lot of other people who are in the space because of how I came to things, right? So if you go out and you talk to a lot of lawyers, a lot of accountants, we have lawyers and accountants who work for us, right, who are on our team, and very good people, often very smart people, lots of expertise, might be very educated, know lots of nuances, etc. That's great. But very often they don't have a practical, operational business take on it. And to me, this is really, really important, okay? So I'll give you a for instance, right? It's less common today because banking is impossible pretty much for, say, a BVI company. But it used to be, you'd go to see some lawyer, they'd be like, oh, okay, great, we're gonna form you a company in BVI. Well, that might have been great if you were just talking about from a tax standpoint at that point in time, okay? But then if you were to look at, say, something like payment processing, well, then now becomes close to impossible to get payment processing, and your rates, if you do get it, are gonna be much higher. So all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, maybe that's not so great. Maybe you'd say, all right, hey, listen, it's great that you should form a company in XYZ country, but you're like, well, hang on a minute. The labor market there is tiny, so I can't get skilled labor. Nobody's really going to want to move there. It's going to be a hassle. Maybe the infrastructure isn't so good. Maybe the work culture isn't so good. Things like this, right? And so as a result, I'm going to get comfortable here. Maybe here for a few minutes. Anyway, so as a result, you end up in this situation where it's just not a practical structure, okay? So my background is I came from entrepreneurship. To this day, I have multiple different businesses that I'm doing, etc. And it is very key that when I'm thinking about structuring, I'm thinking about practicality. And what triggered it to me specifically, I had, of course, just kind of like Googled around, read some articles, this idea, hey, you can pay no tax, seemed kind of interesting. I would read stuff. Some people would say, oh, Seychelles is the place to be. Some people say British Virgin Islands or Cayman Islands or whatever is the place to be. You have these little charts. Back then, it seemed very novel. This is, I guess, early to mid 2000s. But I didn't know anything about it. I didn't dabble into it, etc. And good thing I didn't because, as I tell people all the time, it's not so simple as just setting up a company in a particular country and getting going. If it was, everybody would do it, and the IRS or whoever would be out of business, right? So it doesn't actually work that way. But that being said, I was like a little leery. It's like, okay, is this a scam? How does this work? And so on and so forth. Okay, so I kind of I had like a loose concept of it. I think a lot of people do, right? I think that you can go and you can pay attention to the mainstream. I often get people who are, they're just like, they have some headline. They think that the media is a good source of information. It's not, it's horrible. And they'll go and they'll say, oh, if I had a bunch of money, I'd set up in Ireland. And I'm like, you clearly have no idea what you're talking about. Like, not even a clue what you're talking about. So, good thing that I didn't go down that road. I then ended up in a situation where myself and some partners were raising some money and investing between Canada and the US, okay? And what this forced me to do was to go and deal with, hey, how should we structure this, right? I never really thought about structuring on that level before. Prior to that, I dealt with some real estate deals, and so there was some structuring around limited partnerships and how money gets raised with investors and things like this. So I had like some very loose concepts, but I didn't really understand much beyond that. Here, I was forced to confront this thing that, hey, listen, as somebody from Canada, the consequences in the US were different than somebody in the US. And the consequences were different in terms of banking. Banking was like this nightmare. And so I would talk to lawyers in the US, I would talk to lawyers in Canada. And based on that happening, the lawyers in the US would tell me, oh, you should do this. And I'd say, okay, great, but I'm from Canada. And I'd be like, oh, then I can't advise you. And I'd talk to the lawyers in Canada, and they'd say, do this. And I'd say, but we're investing in the US. They'd be, oh, then I can't advise you. And this was super frustrating, right? Super, super frustrating that there seemed to be a real dearth of understanding when you cross borders. And to this day, this is really our expertise. At Offshore Capitalist, Offshore Citizen, our expertise is not here and not here. We of course have understanding on both sides, and we collaborate with, and we have great experts that we work with in each side, whether it's Canada or Australia or Mexico or Indonesia or Malaysia or one of 50 or so countries that we deal with. But the real thing is, what are the consequences when you cross borders? And we have all kinds of lawyers and banks, etc., who will reach out to us for advice specifically about that, because that is not something that is understood. Like when I started getting into it, so we ended up figuring a bunch of things out ourselves, particularly with respect to banking. And a friend of mine had similar questions, and we had some conversation through this. He'd had some international business experience, and he had ultimately consulted with some very, very good attorneys. Right, some people were very brilliant, legal minds, tax minds, and they had said, hey, listen, if you want to go into this business, we will back you and do the legal and tax work. And so he'd reached out to me and said, hey, listen, what do I have to do to get you to come on? And that was kind of the start of things. I had really, really good mentorship from people who in many cases had drafted the laws, and they just understood this world, which is quite arcane in a way that very, very few people did, and had a lot of experience with it, and could help to navigate through nuances that you just wouldn't think of, and made a pretty big difference. And that was kind of how I got started, was I went and started working with them, and basically they would be the ones who would ultimately make all the decisions, etc., and do things, but I would help to formulate and communicate what it was that was going on, and increasingly would practice structuring, and over a number of years, received mentorship, etc. And then, we ended up hiring various different lawyers who we worked with, and there's a long story behind that. But that's kind of how it started out for me, right? It started out as being an entrepreneur, which is, I think, one of the reasons why I have quite a different background in it than many people do. And then the second thing that I think is quite interesting, that is very different, and it's hard to say to what extent it helps me, but what I notice about it is when I've historically dealt with a lot of problems in terms of how to structure, how to solve problems, this sort of thing, I find that I'm often able to come up with solutions that many other people aren't able to. It's what some friends of mine refer to as thinking three-dimensional, okay? And I think where this comes from is I did card magic back in the day. So I was quite interested when I was a very young kid in Houdini and these different magicians who, these escape artists and all this kind of thing. And I didn't pursue it at all for years and years and years. And then I had an opportunity at some point in time. I'd seen some things on TV, and I was like, oh, I wonder how they would do that. And I started playing around, and it led to this about 4 or 5 year dive when I wrote some books and things like this on the subject of card magic and card manipulation, card tricks, this sort of thing. And the thing about it when you get into magic is that magic requires you to think very differently about things. A lot of people are used to this is what it is, okay, what do we do with that? And in magic, it's the exact opposite. You need to start with the assumption that it isn't what it is, okay? So, for instance, you might say, say I have a coin here, and I go and I take it, and I put it here and I vanish it. I should do some magic for you guys some point in time. And lo and behold, the coin is gone, right? And then, I reach into my pocket and, oh, look, here's the coin, right? Or grab it over from here or whatever. And you can say, okay, well, clearly the coin, it's impossible that things actually vanish. So it didn't really disappear from here and it didn't really appear here. So what I have to do is I have to make the appearance that that has happened without it actually happening, right? So for instance, in what I kind of just mocked for you there, I would do something called a French drop. So I'd have this coin, I would appear to pick it up here, but I would actually keep it here, Then I would go and I would do what's something called a time delay, and I would go and I would appear to make it vanish, and it would actually still be in this hand, but somebody wouldn't notice. And then I would go and I would reach into this pocket and I would pull it out, but I actually loaded it at the time. That's like a very, very super simple concept of what would happen, right? And we would do these exercises in Magic called Proving the Impossible, where somebody would throw out a challenge. They would say, hey, here's the effect that you have to create, and here's your constraints. And then over the course of the month, magicians would compete by submitting their solution to that problem. How do you do it, right? How do you take a card, rip it up into 4 pieces, throw it into a box, shake the box, and have the card visually become whole again, and pull it out and you can see this. And there's a really cool solution for how you do that, right? So I think that type of thinking was very useful for me in being able to come up with solutions that many other people wouldn't come up with, right? Is because you start by, I remember specifically we were doing a structure one time. It was a company that we wanted to restructure their payment processing. Okay, they're a fairly large company, and our goal was to reduce their payment processing costs. But what we wanted to do was not have a decrease in, not have an increase in their taxes in the process of doing the payment processing. And so, a lot of people would just kind of go out and negotiate payment processing. The approach that I took was I said, okay, where can we go in the world that has the lowest payment processing rates, right? And turns out the lowest payment processing rates were in Europe. There's some consequences of that. And so you may want to process some in the US. And so we ended up with this cascading mid. So it was like you would run the transaction in Europe first, and because the rates were lower there. Then if it wouldn't go through because you'll get a higher decline rate on US cards from a foreign processor, then it would cascade to the next mid, and it would try it again in the US. And if it would pass, then great. That way you wouldn't have the loss that would come from having the declines, but you would still get the lower rates, right? But then the question becomes, okay, well, if you can get lower rates in Europe, what about the taxes in Europe, right? And so it became, okay, well, where do you find in Europe that you can get low taxes and do this? And, so we found, okay, we can get these low rates here, but the problem is that that's going to be taxable, but we can avoid it being taxed this way, but then when we transfer it back to the parent company, because it's just a processing company, it's not doing anything, right? There's going to be dividend withholding. So how do you go and you make it so you don't have the dividend withholding, right? And so it's like this fun process of thinking through, like a lot of people would just say, okay, here's the way that it is. Oh, this is what you're going to have to pay. It's like, well, hang on. I don't want to pay that. What do you do to get out of it? And this is one of the things that I try to bring as a value add. And I think there's like a really major area that we can add value is, yeah, we have expertise. Yeah, we have relationships. Those making us stand out. But very few people will then combine those things with a particular, very practical, three-dimensional thinking that helps to make very real, concrete, real-world scenarios that are going to be beneficial to the end client and help them to get to the goal. And it's probably unfortunate, it probably isn't in the best interest of society that the way that you work with rules can yield you a different result. The example that I often use for people is whether you pay yourself a wage or whether the company pays profits on the tax on the profits and then pays a dividend often has a material difference on how much money the person ends up with at the end. This probably shouldn't be the case, right? From the perspective of the good of society, this is just consuming brain power on something that has zero value add. But that is the reality, right? The reality of the world that we live in is that how you frame something makes a difference. Is this a loan or is this something else, right? Is this payment a payment for a royalty or is it payment for a service? This makes a difference, right? There's lots of examples of this sort of thing. And so, by being able to think about these these problems in different ways. I think we're able to add a lot of value, and it's also super fun. To me, it's way more fun to solve fun, complex problems than it is to just, I don't know, incorporate companies or something. We'll help people incorporate companies as well. We'll help them open bank accounts as well. But even that, like, how do you present a company to a bank so you're more likely to get accepted, right? These sorts of things are, I think, particularly relevant. Anyway, I hope that's helpful. I hope it's interesting or something like that. Maybe you can apply it to your life. If you're interested, please, subscribe to our channel. I would love to hear from you guys. I'd love to hear what it is that you have going on that is, a pressing challenge or question that you've got, something that you would like to be able to improve in your business, in your life, in your structuring tax, some risk that you're exposed to and you're concerned about. Maybe you can hedge it off somehow. Go to our websites, www.offshorecitizen.net, offshorecapitalist.com. You can contact us there. You can book a call with me. And I look forward to seeing you guys on the next video.